now to lead our final must-do conversation today, please welcome back to the stage Andrew Zolli.
It's 2:40 p.m., the peak learning hour of the day. This is the asymptotic minima of your energy availability. Like, you ate a couple hours ago and now your body's digesting and you're feeling sleepy and sort of the air conditioning might be getting to you. So this is the moment when we always put the best possible content that we could bring to the stage. And I'm really particularly excited to share and to be able to moderate this particular discussion. This is a weird moment for humanity, and as befits a convening that is predicated on 10 monumental challenges to the flourishing of human civilization, to the meeting of the climate crisis. We've heard over the course of the day, and all of you know, because of the nature of the work that you do, that we face crises that feel like they have gone nonlinear in front of us. We live in an age that it seems to be denominated in exponents. And there's a real challenge there, right? I mean, when we say shorthand terms, like we're living through perhaps the early stages of the sixth extinction, that there's 1 million species at risk of loss by the middle of the century, that we seem to be hovering around an ever-increasing kind of normative expectation that we're going to blow through a 1.5 degree world, past a 2 degree world. Now we're kind of hovering in the mid-twos. And we've already seen what a world at 1.1 looks like, and it is increasingly unpretty, and it is just getting started. And the problem with all of that, is it literally breaks our brains. Because if I asked you to envision 1 million anything, your brain can't do it, and mine can't either, not readily. If we live in an age of exponential change and disruption and risk, accelerating and concentrating risk, there's the fundamental question about how do we think about it? And it can kind of, we all know the psychosocial impact that it can have in literally shutting us down. Right? We kind of go into a curl, a fetal position curl, when we are confronted with forces that are bigger than our ability to compute. But if that's true, it's also true, if it's possible that we are living through the early stages of the sixth extinction, it also seems to be true that we're living through the second renaissance at the same time. And that is also an explosion of knowledge, capacity, connectivity, potential for catalyzing human imagination and ingenuity if we do it right. And indeed, in some ways, if you think about, we like to, in this room, we like to have lists. The 10 things we have to do, the 5 conditions that we have to meet. But really, at fundamental play today, the 2 foundational forces at work on the Earth are the imperative for the sustainability and climate transition, inclusive of the way we care for life, and the fierce urgency of digital transformation, which is, it's sort of, and you can see a weird twinning in this. When we look through the climate lens, we see a world where the global north is responsible for current and historical emissions overwhelmingly, and the global south innocent, largely, of those emissions. And the arguments about what happens to climate justice in a world like that, that argument is balanced by those 2 forces. But in the digital world, it seems to be the opposite. Most of the world's digital capacity, most of the world's computing capacity is in the global north. So we now have a situation where we have all of these tools and all of this potential. If we have to, and in both instances, we have to kind of rebalance the world. And the challenge is, on the digital side, the explosion of knowledge, capacity, capability, resources is also bigger than most of our imaginations. Today, we're going to hear from a group of people who are all working at the intersection of how we leverage those digital tools to create a more inclusive, a more sustainable, a more equitable human community and how we fundamentally rebalance. So I want to just introduce them to you, and I'm going to introduce them as a group, and then I'm going to ask them to come up and we'll get started. So the first is Márcia Balisciano, who is the head of corporate responsibility at RELX. Then we're going to have Meagan Fallone, who is the entrepreneur in residence and executive advisor on climate justice for CARE USA. And then Gabriela Ramos, who is the assistant director general for the social and human sciences at UNESCO. And finally, Kevin White, who is the senior director of Microsoft's AI for Good laboratory. Will you please welcome this extraordinary group of people? So, hi everybody. It's really great to have all of you here with us this afternoon. This is it's a really fascinating time to be talking about how do we deploy digital technologies in ways that are ethical and humane and aligned to the great challenges of our time. I'm reminded of two quotes, one from a folk singer here in the United States named Ani DeFranco, who said, "Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right." So there's a kind of interesting question about how do we ensure that these are still tools and they're used for inclusion and not exclusion. And the other one that comes to mind is from an activist friend of mine who said, if you don't have a seat at the table, it's probably because you're on the menu. And it beggars this question of where do we sit and our positionality and how do we connect around these issues? So the conversation I'm hoping we can have in the next half an hour or so is going to be really focused on these questions of what is the digital world we want? And what are the tools and what are the choices we have to make along the way? So I'd love it if we just very quickly, these are really remarkable people. So I'm going to start with you, Márcia. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the world that you are running as the Chief Sustainability Officer at RELX?
Thank you very much. And I wanted to maybe start with a quote of my own, Andrew. You inspired me. Because one of the things that I do in addition to working for RELX is that I'm the founding director of a small museum and educational facility in London called Benjamin Franklin House. And my absolute favorite Franklin quote is to resolve to perform what you ought and perform without fail what you resolve. So think about that one because that's, I think, very motivating. But in my role with RELX as Chief Sustainability Officer, I am working with 35,000 people across our organization to ensure that we advance our unique contributions to society each day. And those include something that's really critical to our discussion today, universal, sustainable access to information. So we're about data and analytics that make a difference, and we work on this across 4 different businesses. So we have LexisNexis Risk Solutions, which is looking at data and analytics to do things like fight fraud and other crime. We have Elsevier, which is focused on supporting doctors and other members of the science community to get better outcomes for patients, to advance scientific research. We have LexisNexis Legal and Professional, which is focused on advancing the rule of law around the world and access to justice, cataloging the world's laws. And then we have RX, which is a very large events business, which does things here in this very building. So we set public objectives that we put into the public domain that we try to achieve each year. I think one of the critical things that companies need to do, and there are lots of stakeholders who hold us to account, is to be transparent. And we need to continue to try and raise the bar higher on our performance. And as you say, this is a very critical moment. And one of the things that we try and do with those objectives, pointing to my pin here around the Sustainable Development Goals, is link those public objectives to the SDGs. And if I give just one quick example before I cede the floor, we established in 2017, it took us a couple years to get it off the ground, but when the SDGs were launched in September 2015, so we know, as you've been hearing about, we're at the midway mark now to 2030. We were thinking that because we released a free piece of research, we wanted to know how ready was science to support this agenda, and we didn't know all that much about the SDGs at that point. But we developed this tool called the RELX SDG Resource Center, and so we're cataloging content from across our business, but also from key partners to make it freely available. And I can talk more about that as we go forward.
We'll come back to how we encourage the diffusion of all of this capability. But actually, let me just say, I'm going to go to the other end for a moment and then come back to you, Meagan. I would love to, Kevin, because you're working at Microsoft. Many people may not know about the nature of the AI for Good lab and the work that it does. Do you want to just sort of set up the way that you and your team are thinking about the diffusion of these breakthrough capabilities?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. And it's great to be here with everyone today. And what an amazing panel that we get to convene here. As Andrew said, I'm Kevin. I work at Microsoft, and I work on a team called our AI for Good Lab. Our purpose and our goal is to bring AI to help solve some of society's greatest challenges. We live and we work within Microsoft's philanthropy effort. And our measure of success is lives changed and lives saved. And so it's a really amazing mission that we've been given from Satya Nadella and Brad Smith. One of the things that we have pioneered along with our collaborators at Planet over the last year or two is how do we use AI and satellite imagery to really bring additional insights to human rights issues. And when we talk about how we want to bring action and how we want to bring tooling and how we want to bring it at scale, we've started looking at disasters. And disasters come in many forms. One is conflict. One is due to climate change. And on the conflict side, we have worked very closely with the United Nations and the International Criminal Court on how AI can help look at imagery, especially over Ukraine and in other parts of the world, to understand when there's targeted attacks at schools, water facilities, education, healthcare, things that all of us every day take for granted. And we pass that information back to those who are collecting evidence. We also work very closely with our partners in the United States here in response to Hawaii and the wildfires in Maui, so we could understand very quickly, within 24 to 48 hours, what did we assess from damaged buildings so that they could quickly start targeting response efforts. And we also work in information integrity on how we could help them understand the narratives that were disinformation and misinformation. We've recently worked with the United Nations on the response efforts from Morocco and Libya and the disasters there, really to understand leveraging and collaborating with Planet when we can get high resolution imagery very quickly, how can we leverage these AI tools so that we can quickly provide on-the-ground insights to disaster teams that are there to aid the humanitarian response. So we work across many areas. Those are kind of some very tactical examples, but we also work in conservation and sustainability, information integrity, as I mentioned. We work with refugee camps. But AI has a huge potential to help advance a lot of the work that we're doing today.
We're going to dig into AI in the course of this discussion. I want to come now to Meagan, if you don't mind. And part of the reason I wanted to contrast the two of you in this order, the thing that's really fascinating is digital technologies, data and AI in particular, give us what are sort of technological superpowers. They give us the ability to see things, to make the invisible visible in ways that are extraordinarily powerful, but they are often at one end of a telescope. They're at some distance often from the people who are served. And I think, and then this is particularly something, Gabriela, I'm going to ask you about too, is about the how we bring these capabilities and how we bring the richness and opportunity to live in close contact with the people that we wish to be in solidarity with, and to the communities that we serve. And you know, Meagan, I know your history in particular. You have an incredible chapter of your professional biography. We can come to the care work in a moment, but I'd love, you know, in the sense of solidarity and kinship and close work and seeing human capability up close. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that chapter of your history and how it relates to this.
So Andrew is referring to my tenure as the CEO of an organization called the Barefoot College International. Barefoot College is an extraordinary organization, a grassroots organization founded on Gandhian values about community sustainability and the ability of the poorest of the poor to actually provide their own solutions. And to disrupt a lot of ideas around education, both an informal and an informal sense. We took that during my tenure to another level. We started to go beyond that to really looking at technology and how people without formal education both could use, deploy, and themselves manage and develop and design their own technologies. And how we could use technology to leapfrog things like literacy by having user interface and user experiences that were designed with and for them specifically. So the program actually has had some pretty incredible output. We are one of 3 organizations. I'm still on the board, happily. We're one of 3 organizations who scaled a program, a social enterprise program, to just shy of 100 countries. There are very few organizations that have been able to work at that scale, and we can come back to why that is so important. But we trained more than 4,000 to date women, illiterate, semi-literate women, to be solar engineers who fabricate, install, and maintain solar home lighting systems as an access to energy model for the more than 800 million people globally who do not have access to energy still. And the extraordinary thing is that those women who are 35 years and older assemble a 196-piece circuit board by rote learning, visually only. They understand no theory, but they have practical knowledge, and that really was the lesson, is that when you apply practical application to technology, you get this magical sense of not only individual empowerment, but community empowerment that happens. And I think it's that power that I think about now in terms of how do we take a look at some of these new technologies and consider the human integration of those technologies and the human involvement in those technologies so that those technologies further empower human beings and communities. And this is something I think not so many people are really thinking about.
You know, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I want to share an observation. So often we have discussions where the capacity sits at one side of a table and the opportunity sits on the other side of the table, and across the divide we talk about the problem of capacity building. And the thing that's extraordinary about the work of the Barefoot College is that it shows how much capacity is there. And I think about this in my own life. You know, I was probably a fifth or sixth grader when a box arrived at our school, and inside the box was an Apple II computer. And the teacher looked at the Apple II computer for about 45 seconds and said, "This will be of no interest to me," or any of these, just literally. And I said, "Well, can I play around with it in the corner?" And now I get to sit at fancy conferences wearing cheeky Silicon Valley sneakers while everyone else is dressed up a little bit more fancy than me, saying things about international development because I had a 30-year experience, or 40-year experience of access to that technology and learning and discovery. And much of it started and continued in an unguided way. I didn't have any capacity to be built. I just had the opportunity of access. So I really, I think there's something very powerful in that idea. And so I want to come to you, Gabriela, just to talk a little bit about your perspective at UNESCO, you know, thinking about humanity and thinking about the kind of social lens on the work. And what are you and your colleagues thinking about as you think about the sort of the opportunities in the digital in the century to come?
Well, thank you, and so nice to be with all of you with these very concrete and impactful initiatives. I led the work of the social and human sciences at UNESCO, and with the Bridges Coalition and Arizona State University, we think that those are the science that we need the more. And let me tell you why. The fact is that if you see the digital transformation, the AI discussions, how it is operating, it is a technological discussion. It's a technological debate about the technologies, about the algorithms, about the access, about the internet, about... At UNESCO, we believe that this needs to be a societal one. We need to turn it around, because what is happening is that the power of these technologies to, I don't know, to improve the way we manage food systems around the world, to look for trafficking and stop trafficking, the applications are just amazing. But if you do not align these technologies with the best values that we have as human beings in terms of strengthening opportunities, but also in strengthening fundamental freedoms, strengthening human rights, what is happening is that they are just contributing to build a more unequal world. Half of the world is not connected. So what we are doing at UNESCO, and this is something that is picking up because people are scared, and when people are scared and leaders are scared, they look for answers. And therefore, working with Microsoft actually, because we also need to work with the private sector, is that we are making a very strong call for the systemic change of the way we handle these technologies. We hear a lot about you cannot regulate them, you cannot put any control, you cannot, it's like any other sector. We need to build the incentives to have more investments in the technologies that are going to help us solve our problems, and we need to put the rule of law, the ethical frameworks, whenever something goes wrong. And let me tell you, I think that 193 countries agreed to that framework, because in 2021, we got them to sign the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence of UNESCO, exactly with those things. How do we ensure human determination? Because now you hear that the black box doesn't allow you to see, and sorry, I'm not responsible. Well, no. No, of course there are possibilities, even technical solutions, to look at the transparency of algorithm, at the quality of data, at the representativeness of data. All of these things need to be aligned. How do we ensure gender representation in these technologies? All of these things can have a technical solution, but they need to move into the framing, and the framing needs to be ethical. And I would say that what Márcia said, no, the quote, I'm an economist and nobody is perfect, I know. So the point is when you look at the way we establish our objectives, it seems that the technological drive comes from geopolitical competition, from commercial interest, and not from what we are talking about. If we don't change that, it's not going to happen. The same with the economy. And that's why we need humanities, and that's why we need to understand better. I'm working, for example, in a project that is a digital anthropology. We need anthropology to understand the communities. And then what we usually say is that we need to measure what we treasure and not treasure what we measure. And maybe that will change the narrative.
I think that's great. You know, I maybe, Márcia, I'll come to you, because I know that you're leading some of that work on ethical AI at Relics. How have you been thinking about embracing this dialogue?
Well, it's absolutely critical that you can trust, engender trust in your stakeholders about the content that you are producing. And we began a process a number of years ago of talking with our chief technology officers and looking at best practice externally. And last year, it's in the public domain, so please take a look. The Relics AI responsible AI principles. And in a way, publishing that is the end of the beginning. Because it's one thing to create a nice set of principles, it's how you embed that in the day-to-day work, making sure that your organization is aware of what those principles are. And there's a number of ways that we're trying to do that. And if I give you an example, and as our colleague from UNESCO was just saying, it's really important about avoiding bias. If we, bake in bias from the beginning, we are proliferating problems that will not be resolved. And as you have said, there are tools that you can use to try and identify bias. You can create robust procedures. You can do rigorous testing and tracking to make sure that you are not contributing to including bias into the solutions that you are providing. We also are prioritizing in these principles, being able to explain them, having human oversight, and there's a number of others of these principles, and I think that's really incumbent on those of us who are trying to do that. And we can talk a little bit more about the peer review process with being able to trust, because everyone is probably familiar with the case in New York here where someone used ChatGPT and brought did their research that way, brought it to the judge, only to find that the judge needed to toss it out because it wasn't built on real case law. So the solutions that we are trying to build will cite sources, and that needs to be, we need to avoid the hallucination that can happen in just using data that you cannot source back to its original frame.
You know, it's really fascinating to me. I also chair our work on our global ethics program. Outside of having effective principles and things to guide the discussion, though, one of the things that strikes me is that there are problems of relationship, to pick up on, Gabriela, what you said a minute ago. That is to say, the relationship between the people who make the technology and the people who use the technology, that relationship is all filtered through markets, and here in the West, in particular. So it's filtered through the considerations that make something suitable for markets, and it might make it suitable for humanity, but not suitable for markets, and therefore not. And then there's another piece. And the other piece is that there seems to be an awful lot of rhetoric that the technology is just sort of a natural force, like the force of gravity. If I pick this microphone up and I drop it, it's going to fall. If we start AI, it's going to go there. It just wants to go over there, as if there were no choice involved. And so, this question of how we get to ensuring that we have choice, that we maintain the centrality of choice. Part of it, I think, comes from places that bridge the divide. So, Meagan, I wanted to come to you because your work now, I think, points at something really interesting, which is traditional nonprofits, organizations, beginning to adapt the same strategies around these kinds of digital, like you're an entrepreneur in residence at an NGO. Like, what's that all about, and how does it relate to this thread of the work?
Yeah, so the very organizations that we need to deliver in a development and a human development and a climate response and a humanitarian context are in many ways not fit for purpose, and we have to call that out, and we have to be willing to understand what that means, specifically in the area of technology. So even with these great technologies that Microsoft is making available, and the data we are not equipped as an organization to actually integrate that into our decision making right now. So getting us fit for purpose is one of the one of the key areas that I'm focusing on as an entrepreneur in residence. And then the other side of that is really looking at how we use data and we use technology in much more intelligent and strategic ways to deploy resources specifically against climate and climate change and the climate crisis, which is really a threat multiplier on all the areas of work that we normally are doing, and to be more efficient, because the modeling right now shows we will completely not have the resources we need to be able to do that. So I'll just give you one more really hopeful thing before I end. One of the things we are working on right now is to train rural AI content creators to actually decentralize the tools, the AI tools, to allow real-time creation of relevant, localized, contextualized content by people who do not have formal education. So to replicate this model in a way that bubbles up the use and the understanding of AI and other technologies from the ground up.
Well, that's wonderful work, Meagan. I want to come, because unfortunately we're very close to the end of time, I'm going to give the last comment to Kevin. You know, in here we've heard a little bit about what the potential is as an entity that is sitting on this technological superpower. I mean, and it's really a set of superpowers. It's the ability to use AI, it's the computing environment, it's access to data. And as you align the work of this critically important laboratory to these problems, like, how are you prioritizing? How do you get, like, and how are you thinking about aligning AI and the climate crisis in particular?
I'll keep it brief because I know we're at the end, but I do think the point, Meagan, that you made about making sure that everything is tied to humanitarian purpose is the most important thing. What we have is we have a set of tools, and we have a set of brains, and we have a set of superpowers, data centers, this new generative AI technology. But AI in general, when you look at some of the AI advances, it's not, you know, generative AI is the latest and greatest, but we have been on this AI journey for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, especially with the work we do with satellite imagery. I will say Microsoft was one of the signers of the voluntary commitments that was at the White House, and our responsible AI team will have lots to say about that and our commitments in the future. But one of the great points that was made as part of those commitments, it was the last point, and it was that all of the companies committed to using AI to also help solve some of society's greatest problems, in addition to all of the other work that was talked about, bias, et cetera, disinformation, misinformation. And that is real. And I think our primary mission when we look at it is to make sure we're partnering with the right groups, like the teams that are here. We spent a lot of time this week with our United Nations colleagues and to develop these public-private partnerships with the migration teams, the World Food Program, UNESCO, UNICEF, and really being able to bring these tools and to help them build capacity to understand if we can bring in that information, how do we change lives and how do we save lives?
I really appreciate that, and I will say, as a participant in some of those same conversations, today we have all of the questions about how we empower and include everyone in this digital transformation. But if we just focus on this one piece, today we have 19th century governance institutions, right? We have 20th century governance institutions using 19th century tools to try to solve 21st century problems. And we have got to, I mean, if we did nothing else but actually ensure that the infrastructure of the institutions that today are tasked by all of us collectively to tackle these problems, we're using the best tools available, we'd at least put those institutions in the game and in a way that they could actually deliver. I want to thank Gabrielle, who had to depart urgently for another session, but all of our panelists as well. Thank you, Márcia, and thank you, Kevin, and obviously Meagan, for this wonderful discussion, and thank all of you.